Welcome to Spooky History. In today's episode, we're looking at one of the most damning stings in the history of psychic investigation, Project Alpha. James Randi is a Marmite figure, even in skeptical circles where he was, and even posthumously still is, largely seen as an heroic figure. There are plenty of legitimate criticisms of his practices and beliefs, but borderline eugenicism is maybe a topic for a different day, yeah. Google that. Seriously, check out HAYLEY is a Ghost. She does quite a good breakdown. James Randi made a name for himself on television and in critical thinking communities for his almost violent takedowns of people claiming to be psychic. Whether it was the elderly grandmothers like Doris Stokes or international television superstars like Sylvia Browne, Randi never shied away from criticising those he saw as profiting from people's suffering. But it wouldn't be those who speak to the dead that would give Randi his most famous case. Throughout his career, Randi had an ongoing, and it would seem lifelong, obsession with Israeli psychic Uri Geller. Geller is himself something of a controversial figure, with him being described almost equally as a psychic and, more frequently these days, as a magician or mentalist. He even appears at magic conventions as a speaker. Geller shot to fame in the 1970s with his demonstration of metal bending, primarily focused on spoons. Such was the popularity of his telekinesis that it was not uncommon to find enthusiastic practitioners gathering on Saturday nights to shout at cutlery, encouraging it to bend.
He tends to bend spoon, bend spoon, bend spoon, bend spoon, bend spoon, and it bends.
It was the 1970s, pre-internet, what are you going to do with your time? Swinging wasn't for everyone after all. Randi would frequently spar with Uri Geller in the press, but to the latter's credit, he did on several occasions attempt to mend the feud between him and Randi. But Randi was never accepting of this, as long as Geller, in Randi's eyes, continued his spoon-bending deception. During the height of the metal-bending craze, parapsychologists and curious entrepreneurs started to pay attention, and this is where Project Alpha came into play. James Smith McDonnell was an aviation pioneer who in the late 1920s set out to create a small personal airplane for the family. The Great Depression scuppered that plan, but he persevered with his interest in aeronautics and would eventually found the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation in 1939. By the 1960s, however, the company was struggling due to its mostly being a manufacturer for the American government, having few civilian contracts. At the same time, Douglas Aircraft was having the opposite problem, plenty of civilian contracts but few governmental, and struggling to meet the civilian demand. This resulted in a savvy business move and the creation of the merged McDonnell-Douglas Corporation in 1967. But what do James Randi, metal bending, and a man who builds aeroplanes have to do with one another? Well, McDonnell's success in aeronautics meant he had a sizable bank balance and a desire to do some good with it. He also had an interest in the paranormal. So in the 1970s, at the height of the telekinesis craze, popularized by Uri Geller, McDonnell approached Washington University with an offer. He would provide $500,000 for a 5-year research program to be based out of the university, with the primary goal of investigating psi phenomena. Physicist Peter Phillips would lead the research at the new McDonnell Laboratory for Psychic Research. Although Phillips would allow researchers to investigate various psychic phenomena, he himself had a particular interest in item manipulation and especially metal bending. The research would involve investigations of clairvoyance, telepathy, and precognition, but it was the metal bending that caught the media's attention. Initially, Phillips's research would focus on children and spoon bending, but a Washington Post article from 1980 would reveal he was widening that pool. Phillips is going to work with two persons in the Midwest around whom psychokinetic phenomena have occurred over a period of years. For the following 4 years, chalking up 160 hours of in-lab time, Phillips and the lab at large focused their attention on Steve Shaw and Michael Edwards. Shaw and Edwards had for a number of years allegedly been demonstrating a variety of ESP and psi abilities. A number of tests were set up to study these abilities, which would include the psychic bending of metal rods, remotely viewing and reading minds, causing video cameras to malfunction, fuses to blow, tin foil under protective glass to move, digital watches to display random symbols, and of course, spoon bending. James Randi, ever the skeptic, reached out to Phillips in the early days and set out what he considered a series of vital controls to stop any type of cheating on the part of Edwards and Shaw. These included having a magician present during the sessions to catch anything that scientists didn't know to look for. Ultimately, these suggestions were ignored and Edwards and Shaw went on to become, for a time, the most famous telekinetics in the world. Their celebrity was at such a level that when one public demonstration of metal bending was to be given, they actually shared a stage with Uri Geller, showing just how big a draw they had become. Edwards and Shaw travelled the world, giving interviews, demonstrations, and lectures on their psychic ability. Phillips was ecstatic and would frequently pop up in the press to talk proudly about his research and the two men who were now the leading lights of the entire parapsychological world. But rumours began to spread that James Randi had leaked hints at a 1981 magicians' conference that he had planted the pair in the study. These rumours got back to the lab, but they were roundly dismissed. The rumours were reported to Steve and Mike at the lab as great jokes. They had not been asked if there was any truth to them. Around this time, Phillips had, finally, reached out to Randi for advice on how to spot trickery, even requesting a video of fraudulent techniques to compare with the videos he had of Edwards and Shaw. As a result of this, there were a number of changes made. A formal report on the two subjects prepared by the McDonnell lab was hastily recalled and modifiers, apparently, seemingly, and ostensibly, were inserted at the appropriate points in the text. The lab setting was also overhauled. You see, in previous studies, there had been way too much leeway given to the subjects. They were allowed to handle the items used in tests before and after the test was conducted. They were left alone with some items and even allowed to take items away with them, such as the digital watches. These types of protocol failings being tightened did result in a slightly less impressive display of abilities from Edwards and Shaw, but they were still tested and promoted as superstars for a number of years after. The lab said, "We did not conclude that they must be frauds, but only that after extensive testing, they were not behaving nearly as psychically as they had led us to expect." In 1983, as the McDonnell lab was coming to the end of its life, Randi felt a more public challenge to the psychics Edwards and Shaw was necessary, and so he invited them to join him at a press conference held in collaboration with Discover magazine. At the conference, Randi invited the two men on stage and asked them directly, well, let's have a look at the clip, shall we?
I'm going to ask these two gentlemen a very simple, direct question. Can you tell us, how do you do it?
I'll be quite honest, we cheat.
Project Alpha. This was developed in the late 1970s when Randi first heard about the McDonnell lab and research that was going to take place. Concerned that the researchers would not be as thorough as they should be, Randi hired two magicians to go undercover as psychics and see how much they could get away with. Those magicians were, of course, Mike Edwards and Steve Shaw, more commonly known today as the mentalist Banachek. Seriously, go check him out. All of Randi's suggestions and communications with the lab, as well as the leak at the Magic Conference, had all been designed to give the lab the ammunition they needed to catch Edwards and Shaw out. But this ammunition was wasted. They were firing blanks, essentially, and even when rumours did appear, they were dismissed as jokes. Edwards and Shaw found that the protocols in place to prevent cheating were extremely inadequate. Take the digital watch experiment, where the psychics caused the digits to randomise. Well, they had been allowed to take the watch home with them, at which point they put it in the microwave. Causing tinfoil to spin around when it was encased in a glass jar, the jar wasn't airtight. Edwards and Shaw could just blow on the table. Mind reading? They were allowed to handle the envelopes where the written thoughts were kept. As a professional mentalist, don't do that. When Shaw caused a video camera's brightness to shoot up using alleged psychic ability, he had simply reached out and turned the buttons up. As for metal bending, they were able to use simple trickery, sleight of hand and switching, changing the length and size of spoons by switching the identifying labels between differently sized spoons, and hey presto, the spoon has changed size. I like being the little spoon. The pair had even been given orders that if they were ever asked if they were cheating, they were to confess and admit they had been sent by Randi, something that never happened. The revelation of the sting sent shockwaves through the American parapsychology community, which it hasn't quite recovered from even today, 40 years later. One prominent parapsychologist, Dr. Berthold Schwartz, declared that Randi's sting had set parapsychology back by 100 years, to which Randi responded, "Banachek, Mike and I brought parapsychology into the 1980s, and if it cannot stand that atmosphere, it must perish. The kind of work that validated the powers of the Alpha Kids belongs in the Dark Ages, along with other things that go bump in the night. It is claptrap and deserves to be labelled as such." It wasn't just the parapsychology community that was enraged by Project Alpha. Even the CIA accused Randy of gross distortions, though this might be in part because the US government were sinking millions into psychical research themselves and didn't want to look silly. There is a lot we can do on that topic. Keep watching for future. Responses from the parapsychology world were not all completely dismissive and angry, however, with Marcello Truzzi arguing that despite being hugely unethical, at times more of a hit piece than legitimate scientific inquiry, and something that would result in Randy's expulsion had he been an actual scientist, the sting nonetheless helped highlight problems with parapsychology and that his presence was a welcome one. On balance, I still believe his presence in the paranormal debate has been healthy. He has done some very effective debunking in the past, and despite what I have conjectured about his motives during the Alpha case, I think Randy believes himself an honest antagonist. Whatever Randy's motives behind Project Alpha, whether to genuinely expose incompetence and improve research quality, or if it was simply a publicity stunt to humiliate believers in Psi, his sting would prove to be the first part of a series of high-profile stings and exposures throughout the 1980s. James McDonnell died in 1980, so never saw the outcome of his funding. Dr. Phillips is now Emeritus Professor of Physics, still with Washington University, and has maintained a support for and belief in parapsychological abilities despite Project Alpha. Thankfully, this is the one and only time he's believed nonsense. Well, I mean, he's outlived Randy, I guess, so that's a win? But what do you think? Was Project Alpha an important and legitimate investigation into psychic powers? Was it just a magician's ego desperate to humiliate his enemies and raise his media profile? Was it both? Was it neither? Let us know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Spooky History. Hit the bell icon and subscribe to be notified of new videos, and you can support us on Patreon from just £1 or $1 a month at patreon.com/thenoisyghosts. Thanks for watching, and please do have nightmares. Goodbye.